Hello, my name is Ryan Matson. I'm an associate professor at West Texas A&M University in the Paul and Virginia Engler College of Business. And these videos will correspond to my ECON 4312 Money and Banking seminar for upper-level undergraduates, mainly focusing on monetary policy. And we'll separate this out into what I like to call 8 easy pieces, of course, with apologies and respect to Feynman. So what we're going to start out with is a lesson 0, just explaining the goals of the course and where we want to go. What I have here is a graph of it's a very simplified graph of the very basic idea of monetary policy, that we have some growth rate of money supply, growth rate of money demand, which I haven't properly labeled. Shame on me for that. There should be a delta MD there. That's going to end up determining an interest rate, specifically in the United States, the federal funds rate, that is going to drive monetary policy and, in bad times, kind of encourage lending and spending, and then in good times kind of discourage lending and spending to try and keep the kind of moderation that we saw in the 80s, 90s, and aughts going. So we're going to talk about a bit about an introduction to monetary policy, starting with some history of thought in monetary history, again, very brief of some of the great thinkers there. And I'll make up another video regarding graphing and data tools. And I do want to really emphasize that this course is going to look at the Taylor rule as kind of the goal of your learning. This is going to be a very simple equation that will give you a good idea of what the Fed is going to do, and that's really at the heart of monetary policy. We can't always predict when there's a financial crisis, but we can certainly predict what the Federal Reserve is going to do in its reaction. And throughout this, we'll be using the Fred add-in and Excel in order to demonstrate some of these economic relationships. So, on to monetary history. So just to give a brief intro to the academic history of the 20th century, at least the academic history that I'm going off of here. A lot of monetary economics stretches back to 1936, Keynes's general theory. Again, it's a masterwork in macroeconomics and is a foundational work. And speaking of foundations, then that's built upon in 1948 by Paul Samuelson's Foundations of Economics. That is responded to in 1963 by Friedman and Schwartz with a monetary history of the United States that goes through how inflation and money grew in the U.S. up until about until 1960. And then in terms of examining the relationship of money, I am not going to use the simple sum M1, M2 measures the Federal Reserve does, because these are faulty measures. These are very bad measures, especially recently with their changes in the H6 survey. There's almost no difference between M1 and M2, but we want to distinguish differences between currency, checking accounts, savings accounts, money market mutual funds, because these all provide different monetary services. And the best way to look at that is through the lens of what William Barnett calls the Divisia monetary aggregates, a literature that he founded in 1979 and 1980 that is still going on, and we'll use some data from the Center for Financial Stability to take a look at how these monetary aggregates behave. Building then on that, we're going to go on to a Taylor rule, which is based on that great paper in 1993, discretion versus rules in monetary policy. And as a bit of an extension, because it's such a great teaching tool and what's been going on in the markets for cryptocurrency recently, we'll talk a bit about Bitcoin, which goes back to Satoshi Nakamoto's paper in 2009, and we'll examine some of the issues related to money growth rules, the Federal Reserve, and Bitcoin. So that's kind of just a brief introduction of where I'm coming from with all of this. And if you want to look at the Federal Reserve today, the current chair is Jay Powell, and the Secretary of the Treasury right now is Janet Yellen, who, by the way, was a former Federal Reserve chairwoman. They subscribe to, for lack of a better term, what is the orthodox macroeconomics, which is the idea of the new Keynesian economic framework. And so their policies will be informed by this framework, just as kind of in general comment that prices change slowly. Now, there are other views on this, such as the classicals and new classical macroeconomists, real business cycle theorists, There's now an Austrian business cycle school. And then I want to bring in a little bit about modern monetary theory, because this is something that has come up more recently as an alternative. But the new Keynesian framework is really what the Federal Reserve goes on. So when the Federal Reserve reacts to fluctuations in output and prices, they're going to do so through that lens. So that's what this class will be focusing on, and I'll bring in a few alternative views just to spice things up. So what we want to look at is the monetary policy, the response to the real business cycle. The response is to say, if you see this gray bar, that's a recession. You can see that we are falling away from where we should be going on our output growth, and then expansion here we are going above, and we see this kind of business cycle along a trend. I'm using an output gap to measure what's going on and determine when these recessions hit. And when we're below trend, then that's the recession. When we're above this trend, that is the boom. So during this higher growth period, we'll probably see the Federal Reserve enact tighter monetary policy. They'll try and contract the money supply, or at least slow down the growth of it, increase those interest rates, and discourage a little bit lending in order to keep inflation under control. During lower growth, we tend to see easier monetary policy, an increase in money growth, a speeding up of the liquidity that's being pushed out by the Federal Reserve, lowered interest rates, and what they're trying to do is speed up that inflation rate. They're trying to speed up the growth in those prices and wages during an economic downturn. Now, we can also take a look at this in terms of, and as the Federal Reserve does, through an inflation gap, through where are we on now the Fed is kind of targeting, 2 to 4% inflation, somewhere around there. I threw in 2%. This is a gap figure of how far away inflation is, measured by the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, which is what the Federal Reserve focuses on. And you can see here we have this disinflationary effect with this recession in the early 80s, and then a stable inflation rate that they're really kind of close to that. It's a 0 here, but they're close to that 2% mark, right? This is the distance from that 2% inflation target. And you can see during recessions we start to kind of kick under that, and then we see it kick back up. So during higher growth of inflation, during faster growth of inflation, we tighten monetary policy. During lower growth of these prices, we ease up on that monetary policy to try and speed up that inflation. That's really the target of monetary policy. The intermediate target the Federal Reserve uses is the federal funds rate. So this is this response target. This is where you're going to see what the Federal Reserve tries to do, or at least it was. So during higher growth, we want to see tighter monetary policies. There's that increase here. So we had this inflationary period going into the 80s, and now we have the Federal Reserve under Volcker, they really kicked up these interest rates and then slowly brought them down as they were looking to try and beat that inflation, that high inflation, if you remember from this inflation gap here, almost 8% above target. And once we have gotten down to a more calm level of inflation, then we allow that interest rate to rise or fall again. And you can kind of see there's this long downward trend. We have a very long kind of history now back to the 80s of easing monetary policy. But during higher growth, tighter monetary policy to slow that inflation, so they increase the interest rates. And during lower growth, you can see where they lower these interest rates now down to this 10-year period of the 0 lower bound since the Great Recession. So that's kind of the target of what we want to look at through the theory and the data. We want to analyze the behavior of the Federal Reserve, and they're going to influence inflation through interest rate targeting, regulation, and try and maintain financial stability. And then the banking system and the financial system is going to react to this by maximizing their profits and managing their asset portfolios. So we have two very large monetary players here of the Federal Reserve and the banking system, which I guess the banking system is more a bunch of different players together with different incentives. But we want to look at that behavior. So what we hope to do then is, through the Taylor rule, analyze and predict what the Federal Reserve is going to do, and really, even going further back, go back to this Fisher equation showing that, that the money supply growth and the money that is changing hands, the growth in that value is going to be equal to the growth in that real output and that inflation rate. And that's this monetary relationship that Milton Friedman pointed out between inflation and the money supply. The phrase is, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, and we will take a look at that as we go through this course. In terms of the reaction of the banking system, remember that money is a service, medium of account, unit of exchange, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. And then I'm going to talk also about money as a speculative tool. So we're going to have people changing their behavior in response to the Fed, and that will show up in the exchange rates and cryptocurrency, the exchanges between different mediums of account. The reaction of those markets that work with that store of value services like savings accounts, money market mutual funds, but also bonds. Other assets that we can do. We can look at commercial paper, overnight repurchase agreements, short-term treasury bills, the 3-month kind. And we can look at the reaction of speculators. We can see the reaction of the S&P 500. We can see the reaction of cryptocurrency as a speculative asset. And of course, other markets where there is speculation. So I appreciate you guys joining me on this. I promise my videos won't all be this long. I'm going to try and shave them down to 5 to 6 minutes for each one. But have a good one. I look forward to working with you.